Welcome back to the Anvil, everyone. So, today we're going to carry on with the series in which we go into a little bit more nitty-gritty behind each individual movement and ultimately the training process itself. Today we're going to be talking about the deep dive into the deadlift, why it's such an important exercise and how we can optimize your technique to make sure that we get the most out of the movement. So first off, what is a deadlift? Simply put, it's an exercise in which the bar typically positioned on the ground at varying different heights depending on what variation you do, and you lift it from the floor to an upright postural position. Belongs to the hip hinge movement category, and it focuses on developing the posterior chain, which is characterized by a few different muscles such as the glute, maximus, the hamstrings, the lower back, all these different types of things. Now the deadlift itself is unique in that it tends to challenge most of the muscles in the body, as well as provide overload to nearly every bodily system because of one main factor. The deadlift, because you're not in a significant range of motion compared to exercises like the squat, and most joints are in a pretty strong position, you'll find that you could probably lift more weight in this movement than any other. And when we've talked about developing strength before, we know that a key mechanical demand factor for building strength is the load lifted. On top of that, provided the exercise is done correctly, it will load your spine in a pretty safe and actually developmental manner, which causes the upregulation of a few other bodily systems. So, what is a hip hinge exercise? Well, we talk about the 80-20 principle in terms of how we place an emphasis in different phases of the movement. So, if you imagine that this is the torso position, okay, and this is the hip joint here. When we perform a squat, we typically do 20% of this movement in which we push the hips back and 80% of moving up and down. A hip hinge is actually the opposite in terms of how we cue the movement. It's 20% down, but 80% focusing on forwards and backwards. Particularly within most hip hinge movements, we actually isolate the hip hinge in of itself. So when you look at something like a kettlebell swing, okay, you're not moving up and down, it's literally the hip joint moving backwards and forwards. A Romanian deadlift is very similar. The deadlift from the ground up, there's only an extra 20% roughly in which we actually focus on moving up and down, but it is important to make that distinction because we see that a lot of issues people have tend to fall on either end of that spectrum. Certain people struggle with the initiating and overcoming the inertia of the weight itself, in which case they need to focus on the 20% of pushing the floor down, and then the other people that tend to hitch the weight rather and struggle with activation of that posterior chain need to focus a little bit more on driving their hips forward. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go on. So, how do we deadlift? Well, first off, we want to focus on stance position, okay, relative to the bar and relative to your structural position. So we've touched on it briefly within the mechanics of unstable movement. If you haven't watched that video, I would strongly recommend you do so. But we want to align structure with function. So we want to make sure that the muscles are in the optimal length and optimal position to provide as much stability to each joint as possible. Typically within the conventional deadlift, for most people, this would involve a hip to shoulder width stance. If you go into exercises like the sumo deadlift, we start to gain an advantage with things like challenging the range of motion. So the range of motion is reduced rather, so we can lift a little bit more weight. But it also comes with a caveat in that it tends to tax internal stability a little bit more. So within the discussion here, we're going to focus more on the conventional deadlift, but by all means, if you've got any questions about the sumo deadlift in a little bit more detail, please just fire a message across or leave a comment. So within the structural position, we want to make sure that our feet are hip to shoulder width apart. We want to make sure that we are standing close enough to the bar that we can initiate this 80-20 rule of driving the hips back and squatting down without the bar changing position. Ideally, you want to be as close to the bar as you can possibly be while still being able to assume the position that we want. From here, you will initiate the movement by pushing your hips back, squatting down to the bar, making sure that your hips stay below your shoulders and your hips also stay above your knees. So it should look similarly to what it looks like in the video now. From here, you want to make sure that you have tension running throughout your entire posterior chain. So making sure that your glutes are active, you're tightening your lats up, so drawing your shoulders down away from your ears and keeping your head in a relatively neutral position. From here, all you do is drive through the midfoot in the ground, lift the weight off the floor, it'll come to approximately knee height, and then you drive your hips forward. It's relatively simple in thought process, but can be a little bit more complicated in execution, particularly when we start to challenge the mechanical demand. So, why is the deadlift so different to other exercises, and what are the things that we can tease out to make sure that we understand how to optimize your deadlift? Well, first off, it's a concentric first movement. Now, this belongs in a kind of separate subcategory of exercises that differ to other movements. When we talked about the muscle actions in the Spectrum of Strength video, if you haven't watched that again, I'd recommend you go and watch it. But the concentric contraction is the one in which we lift the weight, so the muscle shortens under load as it changes position. We know that the concentric contraction typically within the majority of the human species is the weakest form of muscle action that we can perform. So because the deadlift is concentric first, we don't have the luxury, like we do within the squat or the bench press, for example, of lowering the weight first, gaining that tension through the eccentric contraction, gaining something known as the stretch reflex, where the muscles stretch and recoil, and then being able to lift the weight. Instead, we have to generate that force straight from the offset. And this is where we'll talk about the isometric side of things in a moment. So because of that, we tend to get a significant challenge to the neuromuscular system to produce enough force to be able to get the bar moving. And as we talked about before, ultimately the concentric contraction is where we develop a lot of power as well. So because we have this concentric bias position that we need to be in, we know that the start is absolutely crucial. It's key, it's the focus of the entire deadlift. If your start position is wrong or suboptimal or not tight enough, as we'll talk about in a moment, your deadlift is going to be suboptimal for you as an individual. Now again, just to reiterate, that doesn't mean you can't get stronger within the deadlift. It just means you might not necessarily maximize your potential. I know I myself, I spent years with a suboptimal deadlift position. It still got stronger, okay, but it wasn't until I cleaned up the start position and followed each of these steps that I actually gained a significant increase on my deadlift. So, interestingly enough, a study that I did back in my master's thesis at university was to analyse the force characteristics of a deadlift. Now, it sounds very geeky and nerdy, but I learned something distinctive about the deadlift movement. And this is that when you go to lift the weight off the ground, okay, you have to overcome an inertial value. So Newton's first law of motion, a law of inertia, that the object will remain stationary or in constant motion unless an external force is acted upon it. And this produces what's known as an inertial value, which actually makes it harder to initially overcome than a weight that is already moving. And this is one of the reasons why, if you've ever watched a strongman that rolls the bar, that's the initial theory, although I don't necessarily encourage that technique. It's one of the reasons why people tend to do that, because it already gets the bar moving. So because we have to overcome the inertia, when we talked about a moment ago it being concentric only, or concentric first, it's actually not when you dig a little bit deeper, it's isometric first. So the isometric contraction is when tension is produced with no actual movement, okay? Within this, within the deadlift in particular, the demand for the isometric contraction is actually greater than it is to move the weight. So within this kind of, when we understand these muscle actions, it becomes apparent as to one of the reasons why the deadlift is so good at developing overall neuromuscular strength. As we talked about in the Spectrum of Strength video, isometric contractions allow the body and teach the body to recruit more motor units all at once without necessarily increasing their injury risk. So if you're deadlifting within a really, really good start position, ultimately it's one of the few exercises that will develop your nervous system unlike any other. It's one of the reasons why most strongman athletes or powerlifters or whoever, if they're a specialist, okay, so you get a lot of powerlifters that are bench press specialists, for example, they will still include deadlifts within that because they get a stronger central nervous system. Strongmen, there's tons of strongmen that never squat. They never do the squat movement. It beats them up. There's too much of a mechanical kind of strain in terms of the joints and whatnot. But most of them will continue to deadlift. And you'll find that the ones that struggle to deadlift, okay, a lot of strength athletes that struggle to deadlift will have a deficit somewhere else in their performance because the nervous system just isn't being under the same amount of demand as it is for someone who is regularly deadlifting. And again, like I said, it's because of this initial isometric contraction where it's recruiting the nervous system to a much greater degree. So because we have this scenario where we have isometric tension first, okay, and then it's a concentric contraction afterwards, the absolute key is, can you remember what tenet number 2 is? So tenets of strength series, what is tenet number 2? Okay, it's tension over position. Now the key with this is, just because you can get down to the bar, okay, if you lose tension to get there or you're not tight within that start position, your injury risk goes up through the roof. And this is one of the biggest problems, not only your injury risk, but your performance actually decreases. This is one of the biggest problems that we tend to find with people when they say, I don't deadlift, it's bad for my back, or I can't deadlift, or no matter what I do, it won't seem to increase. It's typically because they neglect tenet number 2 and they just don't generate tension at the start. You've got to remember, when you're in a squat or when you're in a press up and you have that eccentric contraction first, we've spoken about the fact that the body's biofeedback is heightened, okay? So the body can detect what is going on when it's under eccentric contraction, and it prepares the body and prepares different systems to initiate more force within the concentric contraction. Like I said, it's called the stretch shortening cycle. Within the stretch shortening cycle, there are two main contributing factors, okay? You have the passive stretch reflex, so to speak, which is where the tendons basically, it's literally like a spring, they just bounce off one another. But then you also have a neuromuscular component, or an active component, in which when the muscles, or the proprioceptors within the muscle rather, detect that rate of change, or detect the change in length, okay, an impulse is sent to the brain and sent back through what's known as a reflex arc, that basically switches on the muscles and dials them up to 100. Within the deadlift, we don't get that, like I said. So we're in a position where the tension that is in the start of the movement, you have to generate yourself. Okay? So, and this goes on to the next point. Why is the deadlift this kind of exercise where people fall on one side of the camp or the other? I've had people before now, when they first come to me, that they can deadlift a really, really heavy weight, okay? And then when they go off on their own, bang, there's an injury. And then they come back, and then, you know, and we've had to just work on drilling technique and making sure that they're in a strong start position. And again, it goes back to which law? The law of consistency. We want a consistent progression over time. We want that technique to be consistent, and we want it to be tense, and we want that tension throughout the body. So the final thing within the deadlift is to maximize your potential within the deadlift is understanding how the tension side of things links to bracing mechanics and the spine. Okay, so within the intra-abdominal pressure lecture that we've had previously, we talked about the fact that the bodily systems will down-regulate, okay, and they'll switch off to a certain degree if they detect a significant amount of stress on the spine. So in order for us to maximize your deadlift, we need to make sure that that pressure is there and that we are keeping the spine stable. And appropriate loading, okay? There's far too many people that I see that want to dive straight into lifting heavy within the deadlift. I've done it myself, okay? I've had times where I pushed myself, you know, to the absolute limit every single week, hoping that that will increase my deadlift performance. Whereas ultimately, we're looking at refining a solid start position in which we can understand how to stay tight in the start position as well, and making sure that we are bracing. If the load is too high, particularly in the earlier stages, that stuff will go out the window. Okay, so there's a lot of people that I work with, or when they first come into the forge, that they want to be lifting heavy, okay? And it's not to say that we won't, it's just understanding within what variation of the deadlift. So for example, if you wanted to handle really, really heavy loads, okay, and it's just something you wanted to get that nervous system response, this is where things like block deadlifts become very, very important and very useful. Yeah, you'll get a couple of people that will say that it won't transfer over or anything like that, but ultimately it allows you to challenge that extra load because the range of motion is a little bit lower. But when we're looking at a specific movement, like the conventional deadlift, and we want to really, really drill technique, it always boils down to appropriate load again, and making sure that we gradually increase that over time. So, just to summarize a deep dive into the deadlift, it's a hip hinge movement, okay, that is isometric and concentric in nature. Because it's an isometric contraction first, we get that overload to those motor units, and it will ultimately develop neuromuscular strength, unlike very few exercises. And then the concentric contraction afterwards, okay, that's when we get that real contribution to developing power in other movements as well. The start position is absolutely crucial, okay? If you're looking for top tips and everything like that, your start position needs to be tense, and you need to generate the tension yourself because we don't have that eccentric contraction first. So you want to stay tight in the bottom position. And when I say tight, I refer to generating intra-abdominal pressure. So if you haven't seen that lecture, go back and watch that, where we brace the abs effectively, and generating tension throughout the upper back, glutes, and the rest of the posterior chain. And then finally, to really, really maximize your deadlift potential, you want to focus on, and we will focus on within the forge, a appropriate loading scheme that gradually increases over time, rather than diving straight into the heavier stuff. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed the deep dive into the deadlift. I've just got 3 questions to tickle a little bit of curiosity and take away a few lessons from today's lecture. So, first off, what's your favourite variation of the deadlift? Again, there's no right or wrong answer to this, it's just curiosity. I just want to see if you have a preference, if you prefer the sumo over the conventional, and if you want me to dive into that in a little bit more detail. Number 2, a memory test, or to make sure that you took away something. What type of muscle action comes first within the deadlift? So what type of muscle action comes first within the deadlift movement? Number 3, have you ever suffered any plateaus within the deadlift? So no matter what you seem to do, it just doesn't seem to increase. Or have you ever suffered any back pain within the deadlift? So you've either an injury or a nagging kind of persistent pain whenever you perform the deadlift exercise.